The next day we went to Versailles, which was about a 40-minute train ride south and west of Paris. You see, the kings of Paris, Louis XIV, he didn't think the palace, the Louvre, was big enough or nice enough, so he created this new one in Versailles outside the city. And it had this golden gate. The Palace of Versailles is slightly smaller than the Louvre, but not much, and along with the palace, they had 250 acres of formal gardens, which just made it really over the top.
Ladies and gentlemen, your attention please. All west.
There was this long west-facing hallway. It had windows on the west side and mirrors on the opposite side and all these glass chandeliers that was supposed to really just light up when the sun set in the evening. This was the king's bedroom, and like everything, it was over the top. The only thing that seemed weird was their beds were really small. Like, they probably were smaller than our queen-size bed, even though they were really tall, surrounded by the canopy. But all the beds in the whole place were really small by our standards. This big room at the palace was a gallery, and it was specifically had the big paintings of all the battles of the past, and most of them were, the French were triumphant and all that, but they also had this art exhibit going on where they brought in some more modern art that shows how we portray some of the realities of war these days as compared to the glorious battle paintings that were up on the walls of the gallery at Versailles. And that was a really interesting contrast, I thought. I was very impressed with them. Pictures like this, mixed in with was already there.
It must be that the musical displays just occur every so often or something.
And as it turned out, that woman was right. It wasn't long before fountains would start spraying, but before that you can see this panning around. And now you can see the Palace of Versailles from just outside in the gardens. Just how huge it is from just seeing it from the front. These gardens were there were like maybe a dozen giant squares, and you had to find your way through almost mazes of shrubbery and such, and then you'd come to a central area that had a fountain, or in this case this big column circle with statues in the middle and these bird baths all around the outside. And as we go through here, you'll see each of these fountains were the center of their own little gardens, and it just went on and on. We wandered through it for forever, it seemed like. This was actually my favorite fountain of all. This was supposed to be Apollo in a chariot pulled by horses, and it was as though he was coming up out of the water, and there were these strange fish that were spraying water and buglers announcing him coming. And there's another picture of it later when the fountain's not spraying, where you can see Apollo a little better, but I thought this one was really great. Here's the map again of the gardens, and I put in red the kind of the route we took that shows you just a part of what Versailles is like. This is what happened when you turned around from where you're at the fountain I liked, and you look back towards the Palace of Versailles, the big palace I showed you a little bit ago. That's it, way off in the distance there. Now here's an expanded map of Versailles that shows not just the area we were in before, but it shows the big lake in the shape of a cross that the king had dug so he could sail his galleons on. And then it shows off to the right where Marie Antoinette had a small palace and a farm and everything where she could hang out. Now this is inside the Petite Palace, the one that's way back behind all the formal gardens. This was made for Marie Antoinette. As you may have noticed, this was a popular place to have weddings and have your wedding photos taken. We saw quite a few couples that were doing that.
Can move on.
This will show you how the Queen's Petite Palace wasn't exactly real puny. It was pretty good size for a petite palace. And of course it had all of its own formal gardens that went back beyond farther than you can see attached to it as well. Here's Apollo's chariot again without all the water. You can see a little better. Now, of course, every good palace had to have its own chapel as big as a cathedral, and that's the top of the one at the palace. This is all up by the main palace of Versailles again. Now we've hiked back through the gardens from the Petite Palace to get here. We spent most of the day at Versailles, but we got back to Paris in time to tour the Sainte Chapelle, an old Gothic cathedral with huge stained glass windows. And this little map or chart shows how each window showed pictures of a different book of the Bible, and you went around from one side to the other and saw it all in pictures. The Sainte Chapelle was built between 1242 and 1248 in just 6 years. Remember, it took 200 years to build the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and was built mostly to house the relics from the Passion of the Christ. The most famous of these was the Crown of Thorns, which was acquired in 1239 for a sum that exceeded greatly the cost of building the chapel itself. And they still have what they believe to be the original Crown of Thorns, although now, instead of being on display on the altar of this chapel, it's in a vault at the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And there's just one day a year where the public are allowed to go in and look at it, if I remember right. This chapel is another good example of Gothic flying buttresses supporting keeping the roof up, because there's so much glass, there's almost no walls. And on the outside, the front of it, the carvings show everything from the creation of the world to the final judgment, with the saints and sinners all across the top. Next, we went to the Arc of the Triomphe and went up a spiral staircase to get on top. This thing was big, really big. We had gone up a spiral staircase on one side, and then across the museum that was through the top of it on the inside, and then came up on the top and could look all around, and then came down the spiral staircase on the other side. In the middle there was an eternal flame that was for the lost soul. The Trocadero is a big part north of the Eiffel Tower with fountains you can actually get into to cool off. I really went thinking the Eiffel Tower was probably a lot of hype and not that big a deal, but it was way impressive. It looked like some giant kid got an erector set for Christmas with unlimited parts and just went crazy with it.